Hello, Mott Community College students. Well, if you're watching this, I'm at another conference. Hopefully somewhere sunny and warm, but probably not. Anyway, today we're going to go over a couple things. You've done your first recording session, so now we've gone over how to run the session, how to run the console, how to do some basic recording. I want to just kind of reinforce recording basic tracks and doing overdubs. So we're just going to go through that real quick today. The first thing to keep in mind when you're doing a recording session is that there are a number of different things. There are basic tracks and there are not basic tracks. Basic tracks by definition are the really basic things. So like recording a scratch track where the band just plays the entire song and we are just going to use that as a reference. We don't actually care about it. Things like the rhythm section, either solo or in combination, like the drums, bass guitar, drums by themselves, drumming guitar by themselves, drumming keys by themselves, whatever. Or if you have loops or beats that they bring in on a thumb drive and you just plug those in. Those are basic. You don't really have to do much with them. They don't take a lot to set up for the recording. And by and large, they're pretty self-contained. Not basic tracks are the big things, what you really want to hear on the recording. So vocals of any type, either lead or background, or a choir. Because you have to have the lyrics coming to the forefront. You have to be able to understand what's being said. They're probably the most important thing outside of the kick drum. Then major instruments or sections. So any solo. Doesn't matter if it's a jazz combo and you're recording the trumpet solo or if you're recording the lead guitar solo, whatever. A solo is important and you have to get it. Other things, sections. If you're doing a pop tune and you're recording in some strings, that's going to be a major thing that you're going to have to work on setting up as well. And then especially interactive electronics as those get more popular. It's a little bit rare still, but you'll find crazy composers or performers every once in a while who will do something with electronics that are reacting to the input from an instrument. So a little bit beyond just like the effects chain on a guitar pedal board and much, much more crazy. Prepping for the session is really important and really comes down to knowing what you're going to be recording and anticipating any problems that will happen there. So there is a pre-recording checklist, and this is in the book as well, but the quick bullet-pointed version is the things that you need to know from the band, the producer, or the solo artist, or whoever you're working with before you start. First is the most important. What type of music are you going to be recording? You don't want to set up a vocal mic and some beats anticipating a rapper and then find out that it's a mariachi band. That would not be good. Next, how many songs? If you're working in a studio, you need to be able to budget your time and to get paid for your time. So, are you going to have 7 songs in a session that's going to span 3 weeks where they're recording 12 hours a day? Or are you going to have one and done? It's recording a song for a high school violinist to play for their audition tape. Next, who are the musicians and what do they play? You really want to get a sense of what the instruments are before you set up, so you know what kind of equipment you need to have set up, what they expect you to have, and anything that you might have to borrow or rent in advance. Also, do they have all the musicians? Are they missing a bass player? If they are, you might have to pull up the phone and go through and scroll and figure out who you've got that can play bass in your contacts. Next thing, who's producing? Is there someone from a record label, or is the band self-producing? Someone who's making the creative decisions and going to be sitting there in the control room with you, overseeing everything and saying, hey, let's try another take on this, or, let's take down the bass right here at this section, or a little bit more keys here. And, oh, yeah, the singer, wow, boy, yeah, she just totally fracked that note. We have to redo that. Then, when does the session start? This is all about getting paid. Is there a load-in time, and are you getting paid for that? Or are you getting paid only from the moment that you hit record on the console? There is nothing worse than having to do a 2-hour setup and then find out that you're not getting paid for that. So get that up front. Related to that, how long will the session go? And are there breaks? Obviously, you're not going to get paid for the breaks if you're on break, but if the band is taking a break to go and get lunch and you're expected to work on the session and massage, say, the panning while they're gone, you need to know that so that you can get paid. Also related, again, is this everything being recorded at once, or are you doing it in isolated sections where you put one person in the room with a click track, then record that, record another instrument with a click track alone in a room, etc.? Are there pre-programmed parts like beats or loops that you have them give you? And if so, you are going to need to take a little time to make sure that those loops conform to the tempo of the session, to any click especially, and that everything is just set and ready to go. And then again, the instrumentation. Do you need to rent anything or buy anything or call in better players? Or not necessarily better players, but just players if they don't have a guitarist and they need a guitar part. With the drums and other instruments, you need to know how big they are and how many toms. This is going to be a huge factor in how you mic it, and specifically in how many mics you're going to need for the drum kit. So if they're not doing any toms, it's just like, hey, we're doing a kick, a snare, and a hi-hat, you can get away with one mic, maybe, probably just two. If, however, they're doing a John Bonham setup and they have the toms and the kick and the snare and the alternate snare and 15 different types of cymbals, and oh, I've got a different set of toms that I like better, and then I've got rototoms, and oh yeah, I've got a gong. Then you need to know that, and you need to plan accordingly and set it up. Similarly, the guitar, is it acoustic, electric, or nylon? Or, are you going to have to go for an amp as well? Even if it's acoustic, they might say, oh, I really have this wonderful Fender Twin Verb that I just have to have everything go through that. And then, okay, well, you just have to set up a mic on the amp. What types of amp for the guitar and bass, and how do they need to be set up? As with any amp, you should try and get it off the floor if possible, or at the very least on a rug, but some amps lend themselves to different recording techniques. We talked about how with metal, it is ideal to use a smaller amp head on a larger cabinet when you're recording if you want to really be able to overdrive it. But with acoustic, you would want a specialty acoustic amp to go for that. Okay, here's the big one. Are they using their own gear, borrowing stuff, or using your gear? And all three of these are things that I've run into. Ideally, they're bringing their own gear. They might have to borrow some stuff, like they might borrow a super awesome Les Paul custom for the guitarist from a friend of his. That's fine as long as they're responsible for it and it's in writing and you don't have to pay if anything happens to it. But then, do they have to borrow your stuff? And that might happen. You might have a particular keyboard that is required. A friend of mine who owns a studio has a Hammond B3 in there, and people go to his studio just to record on a B3. Other people will have different things. I've been to studios where you'll go in and, oh, hey, there's a Buchla 100. Awesome. And then other people will just have a selection of guitars to choose from for doing overdubs so that the guitarist can get a different sound. They can have a Les Paul sound, they can have a Strat sound, they might have a Telecaster, they might have a Martin acoustic, they might have a Larrivee acoustic or similar. If it's yours, make sure that the strings are new and the heads are new as well. Give them a little time to settle in. Maybe change them every 2 sessions or so, but make sure that everything is in top working order and the guitars are properly intonated. Then the last thing, how many cue mixes are needed? These are coming out of the board and going to the headphones. Can you get by with just one cue mix and use a headphone amp to split it across 4 different people in the band? Or do you need to get a specialty system to do more than one? Big consideration. There are some specialty systems that will allow you to split them up between different people, and they can each control the level coming from different signals. So the guitarist can boost more of the bass and less of the drums. The vocalist can boost all of the drums and take the guitar out entirely, and the drummer can just listen to the click track. Another thing, are you recording scratch vocals at the same time as the scratch instrumental track? Really common to do that. It's not a big deal if they don't want to, though. But that generally allows you to get a demo of the track and how it's put together, so that way you have that as a reference. Really good to have. Is there any specialty gear? So things like effects pedals, computer. Are there any special mic requests? Is the singer, really obsessed with having the sound of a vintage Telefunken mic? And if they are, good luck. Those things are expensive. But you can borrow those from other engineers. You can get them off of reverb.com, or there are places that will rent those. Again, are there loops or pre-programmed beats that need to be set in the session before you start? And do they need any special instruments or gear that's not easily available? Things like a mid-1950s Les Paul Custom with the 3 PAF pickups, that would run about $100,000. A lore-signed 1923 Gibson F5 Fern mandolin, good luck, and I hope you have $250,000 on hand. Stradivarius, same thing. Or really crazy, freaky things. I've had people ask me, do you have a theremin with the linear antenna hack from Paya? No, no one does, because I wasn't alive in 1970s in Russia. So, didn't happen. The Talkback mic, you've seen me using pretty extensively, and you know what its function is by now. It lets you communicate with the band. The best way to do it is to have one mic dedicated just for the purpose of the band talking, or more likely yelling at it in the studio. I recommend a condenser, crank the gain, and set it in the middle of the room. It doesn't actually go into the DAW, just into the console, and so that you can hear the band say, hey, can we get more of Bill over in the mix? Or, hey, I screwed up that track. We need to go back and punch in at bar X. Yeah. Usually an Omni mic will work. If it's cardioid, just make sure it's pointed to get the biggest area of the band as possible. And mute that sucker when you're recording, because if you don't, it will come through. You'll have all sorts of phasing issues. It's just going to be horrible. Worst case scenario, if you forgot to mute it, just delete the track afterwards. It'll happen. And then the control room talkback is usually built into the console or easily attached to it as just a push to talk button. Really, really important. Never trash talk the band. Even if you're sure that it's muted, never do that, because the one time that it happens that they hear you trash them, that's all it takes. Your reputation is destroyed. So be careful with that. So why have a talkback? Well, you need to communicate with the band, and they need to hear you and get feedback on their performance. And you'll notice that some bands, as you record more and more, can be really, really insecure. They need hand-holding. They need you to say, oh, hey, that was a great take. That was really good. Really like the enthusiasm. Let's try an alternate to get a different emotional sense to it, that type of thing. When in reality, you're thinking, good Lord, their intonation sucked. So it's part human relations and massaging that. But also keep in mind that the band can see you through the control room window. And you and other people in there might be talking about, hey, do you want to get burritos for lunch? No, I want to get pizza. Well, what about Chinese? Oh, yeah, Chinese is good. And they might see you talking and think that you're trashing their performance. So having the talkback can save all sorts of really, really awkward issues. If you don't have a talkback push-to-talk mic on your console, There is a free plugin called Mute-O-Matic that you can just Google and download. It works in Pro Tools, Ableton, pretty much any DAW other than FL Studio. But yeah, that will just automatically mute a mic that it's inserted on so that it will never actually record on that mic. It just creates a talkback mic. And then as soon as you start recording, it's muted. Very, very useful. With headphones and cue mixes, these are just so that the players can hear themselves, others, and the recorded parts already there in order to get the best performance. Why would you do that instead of speakers? Well, because it minimizes bleed, and particularly with a good set of headphones, that is a huge consideration, because then they can sit and listen to the performance, come in exactly at the right time, and there's no bleed over. Big thing is to test all of your headphones before the session and make sure that there is enough cable to run them. If you need more cable extenders, go on Amazon. They're dirt cheap, or Monoprice, either one. Then send the stereo mix to the phones, and if you hear that, hey, we need more bass, then you can send more bass to it. It's much easier than dealing with individual mixers, and frankly, a lot of mixers can't handle that. Using headphone amps to split the mix to the players is an essential. Don't just get a couple of Y connectors and expect it to work, because those Y connectors are passive. They don't have the ability to boost levels to the headphones. So as you're doing it, the more you split the signal, the more it will decrease in volume. And let's be honest, headphone amps are cheap. You can get them for about $100 starting, but if you get them used on eBay or Craigslist, way, way less, like down to like the sub $20 range. Big thing with headphones, never use Beats by Dre. I don't care what the performer says, they suck. There is scientifically proven fact that they are terrible. End of story. You don't use those in the studio, especially when you're mixing, but even when recording. Better choices, I personally use the Beyerdynamic DT770 Pros. The 250 ohm, that's the Pro level. There's also a 60 ohm consumer level. Go with the Pros. They'll run you $180 either way. They are probably the best headphones you will ever own. Really close second to those are the Sony MDR 7506s or the Sennheiser HD 280 Pros, which is what we have downstairs. They are functionally identical, other than the size of the ear cups. Some people like Sony's better, some people like Sennheiser's better. I cannot hear a difference between the two. Both of them are running about $100. If you're doing a lot of work with drummers, I really do recommend the Direct Sound EX29. They are super isolating headphones, so the drummer can turn up his track as loud as he wants and it will not bleed through. They are big, they're heavy, and you can fire a rifle right next to their ear if they're wearing those. They won't hear it. If they require individual cue mixes, you will either need a console that can export multiple stereo aux pairs or a personal monitor system. Typically, the aux sends on the board are the way that most people do this, and they will have a separate snake that runs the stereo aux pair 1 to a headphone amp, and then aux 2 to another person, aux 3, aux 4, aux 6, whatever. That will give them individual control in terms of volume, but you would have to control how much of each instrument goes into the mix. We do not have that downstairs, so unfortunately I can't show you how to set it up. A personal monitoring system is something that's new, and you're starting to see more and more. These give each performer 8 channels that they can mix with, and they can get their own perfect mix. They just have a small mixing console that's usually attached to a mic stand, and then the headphones plug into that. They're really cool, but they start between $3,500 and $5,000, so a little bit on the pricey side. Next up is the click track. It is non-negotiable in just about every situation, but especially if you want to use grid mode in Pro Tools and have a nice bars and beats division of everything. A couple considerations for that. The big one is to use a good sound. All of the click track plugins can be configured so it cuts through the mix. The default woodblock sound might be good for everything except for the percussion, who needs the sound of someone going 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, or maybe a really high chirp to cut through their own woodblock. And then let the players tell you how they want it. This is especially true if you don't know the tempo of the song other than, it's in 4/4. But especially if they're counting in things like 5 or 7, where you have multiple possible ways to subdivide the beat. So if they're in 5 or 7, they might want 3 plus 2 if they're in 5, or 2 plus 3 if they're in 5. 7 could be 2, 2, 3, 3, 2, 2, 2, 3, 2, any combination like that. So really get that information from the performers. And again, close back headphones to keep from bleeding into the mix. If the click track is still bleeding though, add EQ and roll off the high end because it's almost always going to be a higher pitch. And then one thing that works really well is to only give the click track to the drummer or the conductor. And when you have a conductor, this is usually how it happens anyway. But giving it to the drummer is a really good idea because it lets the band be a little bit more free and have a little bit more control over their articulation and play a more rubato, more natural sounding track. Then another way to do it is to record the song as a scratch track with the click a couple times, pick the best version, and then overdub by muting individual parts and have the players re-record. Just start with the drums because they're the most important part for everyone else to hear. Just keep in mind that clicks won't always work, especially with drummers. It's not always necessary, and you do get a better sense of space between the notes without having one, but 9 times out of 10 you're still going to want to use one. So that's some of the pre-setup. Let's talk about tracking and what to do specifically in the session. So first up is players and placement. Is everyone in the same room? Hopefully. That gives you a great feel, but there's potentially a lot of bleed. So if you want to go back and record just the guitar in measure 3, you have to record everyone in measure 3. Are you isolating every part? That makes the recording super clean, but tends to lack soul, and a lot of people really hate recording like that. The big issue with placement is that players have to be able to see each other for the best effect in recording. They need to be able to talk to each other and have a line of sight between everyone, including the control room, but especially with the other people in the band. With the session length, ideally you want the studio completely set up before the band arrives. You should be ready to record within an hour because they're going to need to let their instruments tune, warm up, run through things, and definitely let their instruments get used to the humidity if there's fall or spring especially. If it's a multiple day session, then typically day 1 is going to be setting up, getting everyone into the best possible position, getting the mixes right in the headphone, doing a couple of scratch tracks, and determining the recording order, and then start recording at the end of day 1. Just keep in mind that players are going to get fatigued and that their attention spans decrease when they aren't recording. So get the tech stuff out of the way as fast as you can, get everyone set up, and then start hitting record on the console as fast as possible. If you're doing a live recording with no headphones, this is a big problem with inexperienced bands or in a live setup. There's just a ton of issues, and the big one is losing the pulse and everybody getting off the beat. Big thing is to get everybody close to the drums to minimize delay times, and put multiple guitarists on opposite side of the drums, and use a floor monitor for the vocalists when doing the scratch vocals. But ideally, if they don't have headphones, you shouldn't be recording. Really, you gotta have headphones. And if you're dealing with inexperienced bands, the big thing is going to be their own ego. And, oh, look at me, I'm the greatest person ever. I don't need a click track. That is for lesser people. Yeah, no, it's not. It's for everybody. They just need to get used to it. Bleed is probably the single biggest thing you'll have to contend with when you're recording. It's unavailable when you're recording multiple people, unless they're all playing keyboards using DI boxes, and if they are, it's probably not going to be a great track. It's probably going to be like a 1980s tribute band. Just grin and bear it and think of the paycheck. The best thing you can do with bleed is to embrace it and use it as the natural glue between the instruments, and the recording will sound more natural. Just pan everything accordingly in the mix so that the guitar is always in the guitar position, the drums are always in the drum position, the overdubbed guitar for the second take is always in the same place. Really just take notes and make sure that the bleed sounds correct, that everything is in its right place based on how they're laid out inside the studio. To minimize bleed, you can keep the players as close as possible and use omnis. You will sacrifice placement, but it's less colored than if you use cardioid mics. That's one way to do it. It's not my preferred way, but that's what the book recommends. If you really want to minimize it, record a scratch track, then do isolated tracks. A couple of non-essential things when you're setting up the recording session. Record a reference tuning. Use the most stable or difficult to tune instrument like the oboe if you're doing an orchestra. Get 10 seconds or so of the tuning note minimum, and if you're using a guitar, get the chords for the tonic and dominant of whatever key the song is in. Generally speaking, tuning is not always a perfect A440, so if you have to record overdubs a month later, this is how you will tune. Just playing that tuning note back. And then even if you're using a click track, record count-offs. So the standard is this typical 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, play, drummer, solo. Get that on there as well so that there's something in the headphones for the players to listen to, because just punching in with, hey, we've got 2 bars of count off, can be a little difficult for some people. And then coming up here, we've got the assistant engineering role. When you take the internship in music technology, this is what you're going to be doing. You will be at a studio working as the assistant. This is super important to the success of the session, but it really comes down to knowing your role. So you need to know every piece of gear and how it works. How does the mic work? How does the compressor work? How does the console work? What are the acoustics of the space that you're recording in? What are the studio mics that they have, and what would work best for a given situation? You really need to know Pro Tools and not some other DAW. I don't care how awesome you are at FL Studio, they're going to be recording with Pro Tools. You have to know Pro Tools. And then another big one, and this is something I have had to insert because it's been an issue in the past with getting reports from different studios. Good personal hygiene, please. So take a shower, wear clean clothes, and don't use Axe body spray as a substitute for bathing. Just please don't. As the assistant, you are primarily going to be there to be seen and fix problems, but not to be heard. By that I mean don't get ego issues. Don't start thinking that you are the next hottest recording engineer of all time. You are not the next Phil Spector until you've got a couple of platinum selling records. So don't let your ego get in the way. You know, you're there to learn, not to be the star. With that, if you make a mistake, just admit it. It's not a big deal. Don't guess how to do something. You are there to learn, so research things. And for the love of all that is holy, keep a notebook of the session for the lead engineer. So record things like the different points where you spliced in, the setup and panning, and if there was any major problems, like if you hear a guitar drifting out, all of that stuff. Then the last two really big things that are super important, you really have to know how to make coffee and where to get good beer for the session. And with the coffee in particular, this has come up. I have to put this in because this is something we've gotten as feedback from the different studios we partner with. Energy drinks are not a substitute for coffee. You need to know how to make coffee. And as far as the beer goes, if you are over 21, you will have to make beer runs. Don't come back with a case of Natty Light that you got for $12. Get real stuff. Founders, Bell's, Dragon's Mead, New Holland, Boulevard, real, legit beer. Then last but not least, never under any circumstances are you to supply or offer drugs to the band. Ever. Period. That is a great way to end your career immediately and should never happen. Similarly, if they are asking you for drugs, you can get them coffee and you can get them beer as long as they are legally of age. Nothing else. For the coffee, again, this is something that has become necessary to include because so many people are drinking energy drinks now. Good coffee is absolutely essential, but especially if you're tracking early in the morning or late at night. And here is the recipe. For a standard pot of coffee using an automatic drip system, use 1 heaping scoop of coffee, where each scoop is approximately 2 tablespoons, for every 2 cups of water indicated on the carafe side, plus 1 additional scoop for the pot. Add 1/8 teaspoon of cinnamon optionally and brew. For a French press, which is what I would personally prefer, use 6 heaping scoops of coffee and 1 teaspoon of raw sugar, not granulated, raw. Big difference in the taste. Add boiling water and steep for 4 minutes uncovered. It should be completely black and you should not be able to see through it, with a good crema on the top. Then you plunge it and serve it. But again, that's just based on feedback that we've had from the partnering studios that we work with. So please, please, please don't just walk in there with 5-hour energy drinks for everybody in the band. With recording overdubs, you've probably seen me do this by now several times. But if at first you don't succeed, you overdub. Why? Because you can. Disk space is cheap. And doing this makes everything sound as good as possible. This is much harder to do on tape, but in a digital setup, super easy. Also, everybody does it and thus expects it. Downside is that this leads to a lack of commitment on the part of the musicians, though. They know that if they want to try something, they can just record an overdub. So you will run into situations where musicians refuse to commit to a really good track because, oh, let's do 5 more. It will become annoying. The setup for the overdub in the control room or studio is that it's easy to record in the control room with individual players as long as they're not the drums. You lose the studio ambience though, but it's really good for super complicated parts, and you can always use convolution reverb later to match the room. I have not done this as an engineer, but I have done it as a performer. There was one piece in particular I was doing, a piece called Farha by Dafir Yusuf, and it has just this insanely difficult shift in it that is in the mandolin part, and I had to do 40 different attempts in the control room to record it because it's going at this blazing clip and you have this really super awkward shift. But yeah, it worked. In the studio, you will get better sound though, and it will be a closer match to the tracks you've already recorded, partly because instruments sound better if there's some space for them to develop in, and also because you don't have to worry about matching reverb profiles. So some considerations for overdubbing for individual instruments and voices. With vocals, make sure that the vocalist is comfortable. Use mood lighting if you have to. A lot of people put up the white Christmas lights or like a soft yellow standard night side table lamp. I personally use a lava lamp, but it's kind of a green-blue one. If you like that, do that. Some people don't. Small amounts of reverb or delay in the headphones, very small amount of delay, like less than 100 milliseconds, and make sure that that's not being recorded, that's as a insert. But that will help the vocalists to be more comfortable and to think that they're in a bigger space. You can turn the track up to get them to sing softer and turn it down to make them sing louder. Just kind of follow the fader and do that. And then really talk to the vocalist between takes. Silence will kill the vibe and they'll start getting nervous. So tell them what was good about a take and then phrase it so that it doesn't seem like you're attacking them when you tell them that it needs to be redone. So, oh, hey, great intonation, really, really good emotion on this, but I'm wondering if we can try like just a slightly more strained tone on the end of the verse to make it sound like you're kind of dying away a little bit more, as opposed to your dynamics suck and you're a failure. Don't say that one. With keyboards and synths, almost all of them say that they have a stereo output, but it's usually not. Generally speaking, it's phase modulated mono. If you really want to get into that, talk to me sometime after class. Suffice to say, don't record that. Instead, the best way to do it is to have them record multiple times playing the same thing and layer those multiple instances on top of each other to get a really, really big, fat sound and then pan things out accordingly. The wider that the sounds are panned, the more that they will blend, but leaving them in the same spot gets a really big mono feel, and especially if you just detune the oscillator slightly, you'll get like a natural chorusing effect in there. If the keyboard that they're using is a sampler and has mono samples, use those to record because very few samples are true stereo. And that gets into breaking open the instruction manual and checking it. For electric guitar and bass overdubs, it is super common to record multiple takes to make it sound bigger. Slight changes to the tone control are what will make this work. This lets each part fit into its own frequency space. So if you switch from more body pickup to more neck pickup, that will work really well. Maybe just bring out a little bit more treble or a little more bass, also really good. That is essential in particular when you're using the same instrument for each overdub. And that might happen. You might have a guitarist who's really attached to their one particular guitar, like they might have a vintage SG and want to use that, and it might sound really good, but just slight differences in the tone, and that will give it a much, much better sound. Then, if at all possible, use different guitar and amp combinations. So if you start with a Strat, switch to a Tele. The best effect is if you have a humbucker on one track and a single coil on another, or seriously, seriously different amps. Like if you go from a Marshall stack to a classic Vox. Very, very different characteristics. And then with a little bit of panning magic, you will get the fattest guitar sound you've ever heard. Again, smaller amps and speakers sound bigger than large amps when recording because they just do. But mostly because they're really easy to overdrive if that's what you're going for, like doing heavy metal. You know, grab the Ibanez, plug that into a smaller amp head like a Yamaha, and then put that out through a really small, like maybe 9-inch or less speaker, and you can overdrive the tar out of it. It's great. For DIs, for electric guitar or bass, the DI out on amps will not sound the same as the amp when you mic it. This is because it's a direct pass from the preamp, and it's not actually going through the speaker at all. So ideally, if there is a speaker out on the back of the amp, take that into a direct box, because what's happening there is it's running, instead of just a direct pass from the preamp, it's going from the preamp into the speaker coil and then out from there. And this will be more colored and sound similar to the amp itself, but you run that through a DI box and you'll get a very clean signal. Editing with the DI signal is a really good thing to do because distorted signals are really hard to edit. You'll see a black bar, it's going to clip like crazy, and in the most extreme cases, all you see is a solid black bar for the entire guitar part. They're changing pitch, they're doing crazy rhythmic things, but you just see a black bar because there's so much overdrive and reverb. It is horrible. When you have a situation like that, what you want to do is to take a clean DI out at the same time, pre-effects, if at all possible. So get a DI that can split things and has an effects send and return. Take that and use that so you can see the actual transients and know where you can set your edit points. With amp emulators, fortunately most guitarists realize that these suck and don't use them, but there are some people who are like, oh, I got this Line 6 amp and it says that it sounds like all these other amps. They don't. They're terrible. It's, yeah, bad. It does not sound like a real tube amp. I don't care what they say. If you have to use them, keep the distortion and sustain down because these have a tendency to accumulate since they're recording into internal memory buffers and not using actual analog distortion or sustain. So the more that they use them, the muddier it will get, and it will just make your mix horrible. And especially if you're using these, keep the effects on the clean side. Again, it's recording into a stereo buffer to process the effects, and that will just make it further muddy and horrible. Then, the last of the major things we have is acoustic guitar overdubs. And especially if you're using your own equipment, make sure that you have new strings and that they've had time to stabilize and settle into a tuning. So put them on, 2 or 3 days before, up to a week, depending on how much it's going to be played and depending on how bad the strings are. Some brands take more time to settle in than others. Listen to the room and how it resonates. Find that sweet spot for the player and for where the mic will go. And definitely have the player remove any watches, bracelets, etc. to get a really clean overdub. This also works the same with other acoustic instruments like fiddle or mandolin, banjo, whatever. Then a variety of instruments is really important, but especially with acoustics. So not necessarily the brand. You don't need to have one of every type of brand of guitar. You don't need one Martin, one Larrivee, one Rogue, one Breedlove, whatever. You need to have a guitar that has a bright sound and one that has a darker sound. And that way you'll be able to balance out with whatever the performer has with, hey, let's swap this one in and use that for the second take. And you'll get a slightly contrasting sound that it's clear that you're using multiple guitars if you want to bring out the second part. The only other one you might want to consider having on hand, if it becomes something that you record a lot of, is a 12-string guitar. You generally don't need to have multiples of those. One will suffice, though. You can even get a really cheap guitar. Just make sure that it's properly set up and that everything notates correctly, that the bridge isn't warped or anything like that. But that can be really cool to have. Honestly, to have a really junky Squier electric Strat knockoff made not even in Mexico, but in some country that doesn't have any vowels in the name, that, yeah, probably sparks when you try and hit a string. It can occasionally be the sound that you're going after, especially in things like metal. But in acoustic pieces, it can add a little bit of that twang if you're going for a country type sound that you wouldn't otherwise get because maybe that pre-war Martin that you're using is way too clean. If you're using direct recording with an acoustic, either with a mic preamp or an acoustic preamp, you want to make sure it's as neutral as possible so that you can pick up the natural tone of the instrument. Ideally, this means going through the digital preamps and not using a tube preamp unless you need to create some tonal variation. This is a huge thing to debate with performers, so just have a number of different DIs and preamps ready. Good ones that you'll find for acoustics are LR bags. which is kind of on the lower end, Radial Layla on the middle end, and then Grace Design is on the extreme high end. I also like to have a couple of Presonus blue tubes as well, because occasionally you need a little bit of that tube warmth because you're dealing with a really dark instrument, and that will just open up things very nicely. When you're processing while recording on acoustic instruments, the rule to follow is Frank Zappa's: if it sounds bitchin', it's bitchin', and if it sucks, it sucks, and there are critics to tell us the difference. So if it sounds good, let them process it a little bit. You know, using a little bit of EQ and compression or even reverb if it sounds good, but keep in mind that you can't remove this later if you're recording this directly. Also, be very careful with compression that it doesn't kill the transients. So just use a little bit of compression and no more than a 3 or 4 to 1 ratio with a couple of dBs of reduction. Otherwise, again, your transients, instead of having nice clean spikes, are just going to kind of get folded down, and you'll have a solid black bar that you have to try and edit with. Good luck. Same with EQ. You want to keep it minimal. Generally, what you're going to do is use it to high pass out ground hum, so around the 50 to 60 hertz range, and then to scoop things out of the 300 hertz range, and maybe to boost around the 10K, depending on what instrument you're working with. But keep it minimal. Don't add 12 dB of gain or cut at all. Let the mixer deal with that. And honestly, if you don't need it, don't use it. But that's about it. Just some things to consider since we've done our first session with a live band now. And for the rest of the semester, we are going to be working with even more live bands. So think about that. Go over chapters 10 and 11 in the book and let me know if you have any questions.